A lot of game developers have been switching to a live service model the last few years, including Overwatch 2. But now those same developers are starting to worry that they're chasing away their players. Let's have a look. Live service games, or games as a service, are games that continuously roll out new content to convince their players to come back. These games are funded by charging all kinds of subscriptions, microtransactions on top of the initial sale. Some of these games are free to play. Overwatch 2 is one of those games. While the whole concept might be pretty new for the Overwatch 2 team, which is kind of relative since Overwatch 2 was released almost 18 months ago. However, it was Blizzard that was one of the first to implement a similar system for the MMO World of Warcraft. It all started with a subscription and the sales of certain services, like a faction switch or a name change. But they were not the only ones doing it. A lot of other MMOs did the same thing, and at that time it kinda made sense. You were playing an ongoing story, developing your character on their servers. To this day, Warcraft is still one of those few MMOs that can hold on to that subscription model. On top of that, they also expanded on all of their transactions with mounts, pets, transmogs. And while I haven't played the game in a while, I do hear that there's a Battlepass system now. A few years ago, other games like Fortnite, Destiny, and Overwatch started transitioning to similar business models. Games for which, in the first instance, it did not make a lot of sense. At least on the consumer side. On the corporate side, well, they saw what Epic did and they wanted to repeat that success. In other words, more money. To be fair, a lot of these developers ended up making their games free to play, which allowed a bigger audience to play their games. And the whole new monetization became optional. Although it is an optional thing that they will throw anything, including their own grandmother at, to try and convince you to pay money. But look, to a certain extent, them trying to convince you to pay is acceptable. Because making games is expensive, and making a live service game is even more expensive. Nothing in life is free. The problem is that some of these developers got a little too greedy, to the point where some of these cosmetics would cost the same price, or even double that of a AAA game. And you know what? When one of the developers gets away with it, the rest just follows. To the point where all of this just becomes ridiculous. Look, I'm all for exclusivity. I think that could make a nice business model, but when your baseline is already very high, everything on top becomes so expensive that people feel like they're being scammed. At that point, you lose the trust, and then the players leave. And that apparently is something that developers are worried about. Well, kinda. According to a new survey that the Game Developer Collective did, 70% of the 600 developers that they talked to were worried about the sustainability of live service games. 30% were very worried, 39% were kinda worried, and 25% were not worried at all. They were the most worried that players would lose interest in live service games in general, or that other live service games would poach their players. Those concerns were on the minds of about 60% of the people that took part in the survey. Only 40% was worried about the rising cost of development. I mean, look, I'm not a data analyst, but I do think that if you're going to start bumping up prices left and right and making crazy expensive cosmetics is not the way forward if you're worried about losing players to a system or to other people. That's like you starting a cake shop and at some point raising the prices because there's another cake shop opening around the corner. That is about as close as you can get to flipping off your customers without actually flipping them off. On top of that, in the recent months, some games have shown that it can be done differently. Helldivers, for instance. They have a shop and 2 battle passes apparently. But their prices are a lot more democratic. Sorry for the pun. They also don't use FOMO to try and convince people to buy the Battle Pass. You can actually find the credits that you use to buy the Battle Pass out in the world. The passes don't expire. You get that same premium credit in the pass. Now, look, it wouldn't make any sense to copy this model to another game, like Overwatch. Because in the end, the operating cost and the development cost of all these games is different. But I do think there's a lot of space between $5 or $20 for one of their benchmark items. Theoretically. But as a result, they're seeing that some developers, according to that survey, are considering to switch back to the older models, so the upfront payment and expansions. Now, before you start typing, loot boxes are not included in those systems. Loot boxes is still very low on their list. For a good reason, because as I've said many times, that system is flawed. Now, that upfront and expansion model might work better on some games than others. Baldur's Gate 3, for instance, did an amazing job with that upfront payment. They made a lot of money. But I do think for a lot of the shooter games, including Overwatch, it is going to be somewhere in the middle. Maybe a little closer to the Helldivers model. And to be honest, I think that's a good thing. Most players that play that game call it a breath of fresh air, which is impressive because they spend most of the game wearing a mask and they're on kind of alien-infested planets. All kidding aside, they find themselves spending more money because they feel they get a better value for every dollar or euro that they spend. And that, my friends, that cultivates trust. Look, no matter how you spin it, if you want people to subscribe to whatever you are making, you need to understand that they have options and that they have a limited budget both in money and time. If you want to be on their shortlist for where they spend their money and their time, they need to trust you and they need to feel like they're getting a fair deal. By the way, getting everything for free is not a fair deal. That's called Christmas. But that way, these developers and their games can live next to the other games that their players enjoy, without anybody having to be worried about people abandoning the system or moving on to other developers and other games. And in case that happens, yeah, I think then there might be a problem with your game. But I don't think the Overwatch team needs to worry about that. Look, I'm not hopeful that we'll see a price shift in Overwatch anytime soon. I am glad, however, that developers are starting to talk about this. They seem to understand that they need to switch, that they need to change. That basically player trust is their biggest equity. And in due time, that will hopefully cause a shift, including in Overwatch. But for now, that was it. A huge thank you to my patrons. I could not make these videos without you guys. You have my eternal gratitude. Check out this video I made on what a crossover between Overwatch and Fallout could look like. Click it. But above all, take care of yourself, take care of each other. Bye bye.